you list your accomplishments. A prominent Republican close to this White House I spoke to this week said, the issue for us was not vision and ideology. It was one of performance on the issues that mattered most, like Iraq, like Katrina. Do you agree with that?
Look, every president gets judged by their vision, by their accomplishments, by their record, by their performance. We're in a tough war, no doubt about it. I remember, though, just a year ago...
It's not just about it being a tough war, it's the handling of the war.
And I'm going to get to your question if you wouldn't interrupt. Think about a year ago. We had the leader of the Democratic Party in the Senate say, Anbar province is gone, the war is lost. And today we know from every report that Anbar province, because of this president saying, let us implement a new strategy that will deal with this issue, that Anbar province has made a tremendous turnaround where the Sunni tribesmen have aligned themselves with the central government and have turned on Al-Qaeda and the terrorists. So yes, okay, fine, judge us by our performance, but let's not get in a society, let's not be a society that says we're going to judge these things instantaneously from moment to moment to moment. Let's have the ability to stand back and understand that wars are difficult. Could you imagine sitting there and saying, reading the report about the bungled U.S. when the U.S. went into North Africa, which is heavily criticized? We had in World War II. What would have happened if we'd said, oh, you know what? Our tanks were mauled there in Tunisia. FDR, you've done a lousy job of managing the war. American troops go ashore in Italy in World War II, suffer horrific casualties. What would have happened if we'd said at the end of D-Day, oh, you know what, we've suffered too many casualties. Let us step back from this important battle.
You talk about taking a wider perspective on the war. Then former Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney spoke about the decision not to go into Baghdad during the first Gulf War. And he did this back in 1994, and I'll put it up on the screen so our viewers can see. This is what Dick Cheney said. Once you got to Iraq and took it over, took down Saddam Hussein's government, then what are you going to put in its place? If you take down the central government in Iraq, you can easily end up seeing pieces of Iraq fly off. It's a quagmire if you go that far and try to take over Iraq. And the question for the president in terms of whether or not we went on to Baghdad and took additional casualties in an effort to get Saddam Hussein was how many additional dead Americans is Saddam worth? And our judgment was not very many, and I think we got it right. That was the former Secretary of Defense back in 1994. It seems like he's describing... Hold on one second. It seems like he's describing Iraq of 2007.
1994. He was describing the conditions in 1994. By 2003, the world had changed. It changed on 9/11. And it became clear, it should be clear to every American that we live in a dangerous world where we cannot let emerging threats fully materialize in attacks on our homeland. Between 1994 and 2003, Saddam Hussein ignored a total between 1991 and 2003, 16 UN resolutions that said live up to the agreement that you made in the aftermath of the first Gulf War to disclose your weapons of mass destruction and to account for them. He didn't. He was thumbing his nose at the international inspection regime. He was taking money from oil for food and putting it into programs to maintain his state's security apparatus. He was funding terrorists. He was supporting terrorists, harboring terrorists. He became a dangerous threat. And people are entitled over time to look at the conditions and change their mind. That's exactly what Dick Cheney did between 1994 and 2003. But were his words, which don't have to do with whether he's a threat, it has to do with what you encounter when you take Saddam Hussein on and remove him from power. Was that part of the debate about going in and taking over the government? Yeah, look, there are all kinds of contingencies that are discussed and evaluated and planned for and thought about. But look, the world changed. Again, I repeat, it is fine to have a 1994 mindset in 1994. It is no longer acceptable to have a 1994 mindset after September 11th. America needs to think and act differently. We face a brutal enemy who will kill the innocent for one purpose, and that is to gain control of the Middle East and to use the leverage of oil to bring down the West and to attack us again. When you think about how the war was executed and you look at misjudgments, WMD, there were none. We would be greeted as liberators. We were not. Let's take them one at a time. Can we take them one at a time? Let me just lay it out. The cost of the war was misestimated. The level of sectarian violence was wrong. The depth and the force of the insurgency. The idea that oil revenues would use to pay for the war. Would you acknowledge there were fundamental misjudgments in the execution of the war? Let's take these one at a time, if we could. Could you start the list again and give them to me one at a time? There were no WMD. Absolutely. Absolutely we're not. But you know what? The whole world thought there was. In fact, Saddam Hussein's own commanders, we know now in the days after the invasion, thought they had weapons of mass destruction available to be deployed against our troops. Think about this. This man was under an onerous regime of inspections by the United Nations because he refused to cough up what he had. in the way of WMD. He could have gotten out of that regime of inspections and restraints on his government and on his people if all he'd done is said, I don't have any anymore.
Right, but Karl, I'm asking you a specific question about whether misjudgments were made and whether you acknowledge those.
I understand, but I want to deal with each of these because I want to acknowledge the reality behind each one of them. You say, for example, you make the assertion that oil revenues are not being used to pay for reconstruction. You're absolutely wrong.
The prediction was they would pay for the war.
Let me finish. The Iraqi government has passed a $41 billion budget. $10 billion, most of which comes from oil revenues, $10 billion of which goes to reconstruction. And so are they using their own resources to reconstruct the country? You bet. But you know, look, it's one thing to rattle off all of these, and it's a nice tactic. I applaud you for doing so. But if you take a moment and look at each one of these, you'll find that in each one of these there is a reasonable, you know, look, was everything done perfectly? No. But was this the right thing to do? You bet. And has the policy worked out exactly as people planned? Look, Napoleon said that your battle plan doesn't survive the first contact with the enemy, but you still have to have a plan. And did everything work out like people expected and hoped? No. But is it the right thing to do, and is it vital for the security interests of the United States? If we were to leave Iraq with the job undone, we would be running the risk of seeing the entire region plunge into violence. We would see Iran emboldened. We would see Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Al-Qaeda emboldened. We could see a terrorist state emerge in the heart of the Middle East, not in Afghanistan with no natural resources, but in the very heart of the Middle East with the third largest oil reserves in the world. And we could see an increasing danger for our friends and the allies in the region, from Turkey to Lebanon, to Jordan, to Israel, to Egypt, to Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states.
Let me move on to Iran. One of the things you said this week in some of your interviews was that one legacy of the Bush administration would be the Bush doctrine that would live on. This is how the Wall Street Journal reported it in Paul Gigo's column. On foreign affairs, Rove predicts that part of the Bush doctrine will live on, the policy that if you harbor a terrorist, you are culpable as a terrorist. And then we think about Iran. The State Department's called Iran the world's most active sponsor of terrorism. Just this week, the administration sought to designate Iran's Revolutionary Guard as a global terrorist organization. Director of National Intelligence Michael McConnell has talked about Iran helping terrorists in Iraq and Afghanistan. How does this square with the Bush doctrine?
You confront...
When at the same time there are conversations, talks going on between this administration and Iran.
Because you confront terrorism by calling it by its name. And you use all your available tools, economic, diplomatic, intelligence, and if need be, military, to deal with it. And what we're doing here is, in a very measured tone, sending a signal that we will use all of these tools in an appropriate time and an appropriate way. And I don't want to get deeper into it. There are things that are being discussed, many of which I'm not privy to. I'm confident the policy will be laid out in due time. But the point is that we have a variety of tools, and we will employ all of those tools to deal with the threat of global terrorism.
Will Iran face serious consequences if talks break down?
Let's have confidence that Iran will understand the difficulties that it will place itself in, and that the talks will go well.
Let me